Can you see them? Can you see the angels on the mountaintops surrounding us? And the chariots of heaven? There's no need to panic. They're guarding you. They're guarding us from the Aramaean army. Where did I learn to see chariots of heaven? You forget. I poured water on the hands of the Tishbite, the seer. He didn't just see chariots of heaven, he ran with them. My master cried out to the Promise Keeper to protect our people from the curse of Baal Sur. Maybe it was then that he first encountered the chariots of heaven. But either way, he marched into King Ahab's new palace at Samaria and declared in the name of the Promise Keeper that there would be no rain until he said so. It didn't matter how much Queen Ishbaal implored her rain spirit to return from the land of the dead and water the fruit crops. On the Tishbite say-so, the land remained dry. You see, the seer's words trapped Baal Sur in the underworld, and he couldn't get out to bring his rain. What was Queen Ishbaal like? Well, they told a story on the streets of Jezreel of a man called Naboth. He owned a vineyard next to the palace. King Ahab could see it from his bedroom window and took quite a fancy to it. But Naboth wouldn't sell. It had been in his family for generations. And then the next thing poor Naboth knew was that he'd been arrested on a whole load of trumped-up charges for treason and blasphemy. Two strangers turned up as witnesses, as rough as they come, claiming they were friends of Naboth. He'd never seen them in his life. But he was found guilty nonetheless. And Ishbaal ordered for him to be dragged out of the court and stoned to death. They say that his blood ran down the main street in Jezreel and was licked up by the local dogs. Ahab seized the vineyard and turned it into a pleasure garden, leaving Naboth's wife and his family penniless and grieving. Oh yes, and Ishbaal also killed most of our seers. She'd have killed them all if Obadiah hadn't taken them into hiding. And she definitely would have silenced the Tishbite if she could have got her hands on him. And the Tishbite? My master, the seer, what was he like? Just a man like any other. Not so high and mighty that he wouldn't help a foreign widow. He brought her son back from the dead. You have to have spent some time running with the chariots of heaven to be able to pray like that. And that's how I remember him. My master, the Tishbite. A man like any other, who was lifted up in a whirlwind of fire to heaven. A man who ran with the chariots of heaven. Some people see heaven as way up in the sky, a long, long way from Earth. But I see heaven as all around us, like a kind of fourth dimension, a spiritual dimension. And if heaven is where God is, then it has to be a place of wonderful love, a place where you would just feel so at home and treasured and valued. I see it a place of life as well. When I think of heaven, I see colour, lots of colour and life and energy and hope and variety. If heaven's like a fourth dimension and we're in a third dimension, when angels come and want to reveal themselves to us on earth, either They have to change the way we see, so we can see these fourth dimensional creatures, or they change slightly from a fourth dimensional creature into a third dimensional creature. But either way, God often sends angels as messengers and also to encourage people. The angels, as it were, come from heaven, that place of joy and delight. And when they come into our third dimension or make themselves visible in the third dimension, it's as if they're bringing that bit of heaven with them. And when angels move from that fourth dimension into the third dimension, or they make themselves visible in the third dimension, it's as if they're bringing with them all the wonderful things of heaven, of God's presence, his love and his delight. And their messages carry that love and life and energy. But God also uses earthly messengers, not just heavenly messengers. He chooses people to give messages to. Messages for them directly, or messages for them to give to other people. But for us three-dimensional people, to see and appreciate messages of the fourth dimension, we need, as it were, to have 4D glasses. And through the 4D glasses, we can then see into that fourth dimension. And these 4D glasses might be called the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And with these 4D glasses, we can see into heaven, and we can see the pictures that God's painting, and we can see the words that he's wanting us to take as messengers from heaven to earth, from the fourth dimension into the third dimension. And these messages and the gift of moving between dimensions and bringing messages from heaven to earth, from God to people, is called prophecy. The teacher and evangelist Paul, who lived in Roman times, in his ancient letters, which we still have copies of, talk about that gift of prophecy. It's a gift of being able to bring messages from the fourth dimension into the third dimension, from heaven to earth. And when you receive a message from heaven, everything changes. If you're exhausted and depressed and in despair, a message from heaven can bring new hope and new energy. If you're afraid and anxious and fearful, a message from heaven can strengthen you, bring you comfort and confidence, and reassure you. And if you've lost sight of Jesus, a message from heaven can open your eyes to him again. After all, the messages come from the Lord of love himself to us for our comfort and encouragement. And Paul, in his ancient letters, talks about this gift of bringing messages to heaven and earth, which we call prophecy. He talks about this gift, as it were, carrying the Spirit of Jesus. So these messages reveal Jesus to us. But he also talks about this prophetic gift as bringing encouragement and exhortation and direction. And I recently received one of these messages from heaven. It was a while ago, and I was in a very anxious place. I was distressed and I was unsure. It was all to do with a group that I was leading, and I felt confused about the vision. I felt my confidence was really low, and I was actually really, really distressed, and I felt pressure, lots of pressure. And I didn't know what to do. And I asked God for some help, for some clarity. Essentially, I was asking for a message from heaven. And it just so happened that in the evening, I went to a filling station meeting. This was online because we were in lockdown. And the filling station is a place where we're encouraged to put on our 4D glasses so that we can see into heaven and see any pictures and any messages that God wants us to carry to the meeting for the people in the meeting. And it was only about my second or third meeting that I'd been to. I hardly knew anybody in the meetings. And one man had one of these messages. He didn't know who it was for. He had a picture of a belt, and it was woven by 4 colourful strands. And he saw the belt as something to tie around the waist as you use the belt, but to hitch up a cloak so that the person wearing the belt could run without the cloak tripping them off. And he said this reminded him of the story of a famous prophet from ancient times called Elijah, who did that very thing. He hitched up his cloak with a belt so that he could run fast. I knew that that message was for me. The man who gave it didn't know me at all. He didn't know my situation. But that message gave me hope. How did I know it was a message for me? Well, first of all, the group that I lead, the vision that the Lord gave me for it was about 4 threads. And I see those threads as colours. Also, what's interesting is that the man talked about this woven belt, and I've recently taken up weaving. And then even more encouraging and even stronger connection was the fact that my life has been woven with that story of Elijah for many, many years. When the Lord first started speaking about the gift of prophecy that he wanted to give to me, he spoke to me about it through the story of Elijah and Elisha. And so I spent a long time exploring and praying and meditating and studying the stories so I could understand what God was saying to me about my prophetic ministry through the story of Elijah and Elisha. And so this message from heaven changed everything for me. It rebuilt my confidence. It gave me joy and hope, a sense of purpose, and it was incredibly comforting and assuring. And it took me back to Elijah. I hadn't looked at the story of Elijah for quite a long time, and it was like the Lord was reminding me of my calling through that story. In this story of Elijah hitching up his cloak, now in the story he's wearing a leather belt, but he hitches up his cloak and he's running alongside the king's chariot, and the king is Ahab, and he's driving his chariot to Jezreel. They've experienced years of drought, and now suddenly it's starting to rain. And hurry up, get into your chariot, drive to Jezreel before the rains come and make the ground impassable with floods of water. And so Ahab gets into his chariot, and Elijah takes the position of a chariot runner and runs with Ahab's chariot. Now, a chariot runner would run alongside the chariot, often ahead of the chariot, to clear the way for the chariot so that it can run freely. They were there to aid the king and the chariot. And as Elijah's running alongside Ahab, it's almost like he gets an amazing burst of speed. And he runs ahead. And he runs so fast that it's unnatural. He runs at supernatural speeds and reaches Jezreel hours before Ahab. And this story of Elijah running ahead has very many connotations. But what's interesting about the story is that he's running ahead. So there we kind of see the picture of the prophetic that sees in the distance. wearing 4D glasses, using the gift of prophecy, we can see into the distance. We can see what God is doing in the future, what his intentions are, what his plans are, what he wants us to do. We don't always get that in detail. It's often glimpses and senses, but we get a sense of that direction. Sometimes seeing things before we get there. There's also a sense with Elijah that he's running ahead to bring the news to the city of Jezreel that rain is coming at last. Long-awaited rain is coming. And so we see in that typical ministry of the prophetic is to bring hope, is to show people what they've seen in heaven, what God is planning in heaven, the good things that God is planning. And the prophet or the seer takes that vision and brings it to earth, just as Elijah takes that good news about the rain and takes it to the people of Jezreel, announces the rain before it arrives. And what's really interesting in that story, I find, is this supernatural speed that Elijah can run with. And that story and the prophetic picture given at the filling station encourages me to keep running alongside the king's chariot. But also what's interesting is that chariots are mentioned later on in Elijah's story. When he's taken up to heaven, instead of dying, he's taken up to heaven in chariots, heavenly chariots. And chariots are a picture of warfare and transport and speed in ancient times. And God is often depicted in the ancient stories as riding a chariot because they can go faster. And so there's a sense where this picture of chariots becomes almost for me a kind of symbol to Elijah of movement, but also of heavenly movement, because when he's taken up to heaven, it's the heavenly chariots that appear. And these heavenly chariots speak of God's presence and God's power. And I just wonder, using my creativity, I've been exploring that whole theme about chariots and chariots of heaven. The prophet Ezekiel, who lived many years after Elijah, had an amazing vision. He was obviously wearing his 4D glasses, and he saw into heaven, and he saw a chariot. But this chariot carried God's presence. It had wheels within wheels, and there was fire and movement and variety and colour. And it was almost like carrying the throne of God. And so much of what I've been exploring as I've been praying and meditating is these stories of chariots, but particularly Elijah. I toy with the idea that when Elijah went up in the chariots of heaven, this wasn't the first time. I play with the idea that maybe when he was running with Ahab, normally he was just running at a normal human speed. He might have been running quite fast, but he was still running at a human speed. Alongside that chariot, he was Ahab's chariot runner. But then as he picks up speed, it's almost like he moves into the supernatural realms because he's running with a supernatural speed. It's almost as if he's running in the slipstream of the chariots of heaven. And that as he's running in that supernatural speed alongside the chariots of heaven, in that supernatural fourth dimension, he can run with miraculous life force and get to Jezreel so far ahead of Ahab. And so I've been exploring this fourth dimension, this seer gifting that Elijah seems to have, and how that works in his story. And as a creative person, I've been exploring what that might look like. Maybe Elijah ran with chariots of heaven quite a few times. He certainly needed to have gone to heaven. He certainly needed to have walked into that fourth dimension to bring the kind of power to earth that he did. So here is part of the story of Elijah, woven with my story, his prophetic ministry, woven with my prophetic ministry, his seer, his ability as a seer, kind of woven with my spiritual experiences of kind of seeing into the fourth dimension. This isn't a journey of facts and information. It's a journey of creativity and spirituality and connecting with heaven.
I'm Chariot running again, but I'm running firmly on the dampening ground of the Jezreel road. There's a light drizzle in the air. We need to get to Jezreel before the deluge. You can't drive a chariot in floods. I'm chariot runner for the king today. Already the drizzle is turning to rain. I'll race you to Jezreel, shouts the king, loving the rain. And boy, is he going fast, competitive, trying to get ahead. He suddenly spurts forward, thrashing his horses. I run forward, pushing myself alongside. Then he bursts forward again, laughing wildly like a child in a game. We're head to head. Just a short push, and I'll put on more speed. The chariot splashes through small puddles. Water sprays everywhere. I get a smack of it in my face, causing me to falter, lose momentum. He presses ahead, moving fast. Focus. Run. I'm now splashing through puddles, thudding the ground between them, level with the horses who are foaming at the bit, excitement in their eyes. Suddenly everything blurs. Mist swirls around me, and I hear the king's laugh. But it's not the king. These are not his horses, they're... The Ethiopian is laughing, a wide belly laugh. The rain is still falling. I still feel the delicious wetness on my face and arms. Come on, my friend, you can run faster than these. I take huge draughts of fresh, fragrant air. It's just the two of us, synchronized again, enjoying the freedom of speed. The burnished bronze of the chariot is glowing with fire. My feet are pounding on the sea of glass. And we're not the only ones. Now I see the other chariots, burnished bronze, white horses. The drivers are dressed in white robes which flow behind them like foam on a fast-flowing stream. Suddenly, I hear the Promise Keeper's song. I can feel the air around me vibrating joyfully, resonating with the music of it. The chariots take off, soar into the sky. And the runners, they're not runners, they're eagles. White, beautiful, majestic eagles soaring high overhead, creating a huge wind of movement which draws the chariots up into the sky, but all the time moving forwards towards light, bright, bright light. I look up. The light draws me forward. If only I had wings. If only I could be an eagle. If only, like the others, I could fly. And suddenly everything darkens. The white turns red, sandstone red. I can see towers, battlements, walls. I'm pounding red earth, splashing through puddles, pushing against rain which is pelting against me. I can't see the chariots. I can't see the Ethiopian. All I can see is red earth city walls. Then I realize I'm here. I've reached Jezreel. I stop and turn around. The sky is black with cloud and rain crashes into my eyes. The king is nowhere to be seen.
The Tishbite found me for the first time ploughing on my father's farm. Not much of an earth chariot, he laughed, pointing at my plough. And then he put his cloak around me and said, "But if you want to come with me, I'll show you some heavenly ones." So I became his servant, his apprentice. He taught me how to see. I dreamed many dreams and saw many visions. But most of all, I wanted to see the heavenly chariots. But for years they evaded me. Then one day, when my master was very old and we knew that his time had come, we were standing by the River Jordan waiting. "What would you like me to give you, Elisha, as an inheritance?" he asked me. "A double portion of your spirit," I replied. That's a tricky one," he answered. "But if you see me when I'm taken from you, it's yours." Then we stood in silence. He looked at me, and then it was as if he looked right through me and smiled. He took off his cloak and laid it on a rock. A great wind blew up across the river towards us, creating eddies on the water's surface. And then a cloud of dust swirled round and round as the wind got stronger and stronger. It was as if the wind picked up these clouds of dust and swirled them into a whirlwind, twisting them up into the sky. My master was blown off his feet and sucked into its vortex, and then the whole sky set alight. And then I saw them. 2 white horses pulling a chariot burst out of the sky. And then another and another. The sky was full of horses and chariots. It was as if they'd ripped open the sky and erupted through in a fire of flame. I saw them. I saw them. Then I saw my master, Elijah the Tishbite, running with the chariots of heaven.